All right, so it's 5 past. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Christian. I'm joined by Judy and by Ivan, and we're super excited to welcome Professor Gobet to the stream. And he's going to talk about psychology of chess, his own book, some research, and it's going to be very interesting, we hope. And yeah, also see above we have a charity fundraiser, very important, Crisis UK, that aims to end homelessness in the UK. So please donate. We much appreciate it. And this is Professor Gobet's chosen charity. So the format is as follows. We'll have a 30-minute, maybe a bit more longer, 40-minute presentation by Professor Gobet. And then we'll follow up with a Q&A session of 45 minutes to an hour, where we'll take questions that were already written to us, and we'll also take questions from the chat. So, Professor Gobet, if you could introduce yourself, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction, and good afternoon. This is what I'm going to talk about today. Well, first, I'll say some background to the book, and then I'm going to walk you through the book's chapters. And for each chapter, I've chosen a topic which I thought was particularly interesting. In the first half, I talk about more scientific research, and I'll talk in particular about perception, memory, decision-making, and learning. And in the second half, it's going to be more a topic more related to applied chess psychology. And of course, at the end, I'm going to be very happy to answer questions. So the book is a short and non-technical introduction to the psychology of chess. In fact, I thought about writing such a book a long time ago, actually more than 30 years ago. However, in that time, I thought there was not enough to say. In the meantime, I didn't stay inactive. In fact, I did a lot of research on chess psychology. I wrote several technical books on chess and board games, and also on expertise in general. And one of the joys of doing research, collaboration with the researchers and the students. And I have many of them. I won't cite them all here, except for two of them, Adrian de Groot and Herbert Simon, who are actually very famous. And the two are actually fathers of chess psychology. And in fact, they are fathers of modern cognitive psychology as well. So let's start with Adrian de Groot and with the perception. And in his PhD thesis published in the 1946, de Groot proposed a very simple recall experiment. Well, I'm going to call it a recall experiment, but de Groot saw that more as a perception experiment. So he showed a position for a short amount of time, for example, 5 seconds, and then participants have to reconstruct it with you now. So get ready. Here is the position for about 5 seconds. And now you have to reconstruct the position of the board. So try to replace a few pieces. Okay, that's the target position. Now, if you are a grandmaster, this is very easy. And typically, grandmasters are close to 100%. If you are a candidate master, then that's a bit harder, but still you are close to 70%. A candidate master is a player who is good enough to be a professional, but you can see there is already a huge decrease. And if you are a good amateur, the task is pretty much impossible. And here by amateurs, I mean people who play chess several hours a week. So they are quite serious about it, but they do the task very poorly. And as I said before, de Groot saw this experiment as a perception experiment, not a memory experiment. Now, what you can do in such experiments is to record the eye movements using, for example, the kind of apparatus shown in the picture on the right. And that's what I did with de Groot in a book that was published in 1996. So the task was the same as before, a position shown for about 5 seconds. And then we recorded the eye movements, and we show very clear differences between masters and weak players. On average, masters have a shorter fixation time, 250 milliseconds against 300 milliseconds. Masters cover more squares on the board, and also they tend to fixate important squares more often. So here is an example. We have a position to memorize and show that for about 5 seconds. And here we have the eye movements of a weak player and a master. Let's start with a weak player. You can say that the player covered only half of the board. There is a fairly large variability in the fixations. The diameter of the circles indicate the duration of the fixation. So for example, here there's a very long one. And of course, many important squares are not fixated. If you look at the master, more of the board is covered, more of the important squares are covered, even if you control statistically for the number of squares looked at. Also, there is less variability in the fixations. If you look at the timings below, you can see that the master had an average of 260 milliseconds, much quicker than the weak player, who had an average of 310 milliseconds. And the standard deviation was much bigger, 140 milliseconds for the weak player than for the master. Now, the Groot himself didn't really present a convincing explanation of what was going on here. And one had to wait until 1973 with the Chase and Simon in their chunking theory. And by the way, here on the left, you have a Simon. And the idea of their theory, which had been very, very influential, is that information in long-term memory is stored as a network of a chunk. So what is a chunk? A chunk is a familiar pattern that can be used as a unit. The idea is that it takes a relatively long time to learn a chunk, about 8 seconds. You can access it very quickly in less than half a second. And here we have a few examples of chunks. Here we have a chunk located around the white king, and here something on the queen side. Another idea is that in the kind of recall experiment I was talking about, basically players are able to put pointers to chunk to short-term memory. Now, if you want to become a master in chess, and in fact in most domains of expertise, you have to acquire a large number of chunks. And for chess, it has been estimated that you need about 50,000 chunks to become a master, and even more to become a grandmaster. And a very important idea of the theory is that chunks are linked to plans, moves, and other types of information. So when you study chess, when you practice chess, well, first you acquire chunks, and then you link information about, for example, the kind of move you can play given a certain chunk. So you first access this chunk, and then you learn that the bishop can go back here, and that would be a reasonable move. And then the next time you see this chunk, automatically you are going to have access to this move, bishop f1. And this explains basically the phenomenon of intuition, that experts in many domains are able to propose a solution very, very quickly. So for Chase and Simon, basically intuition is pattern recognition. Now, of course, there's more to finding the best move than pattern recognition. And that's something that de Groot has studied as well, again, in his PhD thesis. So he used a very simple experiment where he showed a novel position for actually an unlimited amount of time. And then he asked the players to think aloud when they try to find the best move. So for example, he would show this position, and then the players would be asked basically to say what they are thinking about, and to say that out loud. So the protocols he collected would be something like, okay, white looks better, more space. The black knight here looks very passive. By contrast, the bishop here is very active. What could I do? Maybe I could centralize the rook, put it here. Maybe I could start an attack on the king side, maybe g4, g5, or pawn g4, pawn f5. Maybe I could play pawn f5. Okay, pawn f5 looks good. Let's try to compute some variations. So let's say f5, black takes f5. Now what do I play? Do I play with the queen or the rook? Or maybe I can do something else. And basically, the Roth recorded such protocols and then analyzed them in great detail. And he found several very interesting results. The first one is that search is highly selective. Even top grandmasters, and in fact he had a few world champions in his sample, search less than a few hundred positions. Also, when you compared the amount of moves considered by his players, he found that there were no differences between the skill levels. And I'll come back to that a bit later. He also found that better players were faster at generating moves, and also that better players examine promising moves earlier. The Roth was also interested in the phases of problem solving, and he proposed that there were three main phases. The first one he called orientation, the second one progressive deepening, and the third one proof. And the progressive deepening phase is a combination of exploration and investigation. During the first phase, there is a familiarization with the problem, a preliminary investigation, and there in a rather unsystematic way, plans, ideas, moves are basically considered. And also there is a very quick and preliminary evaluation of the position. So who's better? Should I try to win? Should I try to defend? And so on and so forth. And this orientation phase very roughly lasts about 1 minute. Then there is the progressive deepening phase, and this is by far the longest. In this case, basically the players elaborate on the information that they collected in the first phase, and they carry out search. And search here means basically anticipating moves. So if you look at the figure here, this node represents the problem position, and then there are several possible moves that can be played here, which are called the base moves. And of course, you can anticipate deeper in your search. So a typical example would be that the player starts with this move here, then goes to this move, goes back to the first move, goes a bit deeper, then maybe goes to the third move, comes back to the first move, and goes a bit deeper and with a different move in the, at this fork. And that's happening is that the position is basically explored in an iterative way. And what is very interesting is that it's not systematic at all. So the same branch is visited many, many times. And one reason why players might be doing this is because they can transmit information to different parts of the search tree. So for example, if they find an exciting new idea at this node, they can use this information in this node as well. Also, typically, the players are going to limit the number with 4 or 5 of them, and then towards the end, there will be only 2 of them, like these 2. And then in the final phase, the proof phase, the players are going to summarize the conclusions that they have reached in the second phase. They are going to select a move, and also they are going to check very quickly that the move is not a blunder. So, for example, they are going to check that the move doesn't lose the queen in one move. The Roth was also interested in the macrostructure. He was interested in variables such as depth of search, the number of positions considered, and the number of base moves. And very interestingly, as I said before, he didn't find any skill differences for these variables. Except that the strong players were quicker at generating moves, they were quicker at reaching a decision, and also, of course, they proposed better moves. Now, it's important to note that the Holt compared top grandmasters with candidate masters. And these candidate masters are pretty strong players. And in fact, if you do the same experiment with weaker players, then you do find skill differences in the variables that I mentioned. However, these variables tend to be typically very small. However, if you take very complicated positions, very tactical positions, positions you very rarely meet in normal games, then suddenly you find huge differences. So the strong players, the grandmasters, can really search at very, very great. Interesting here is that the experts are able to adapt their search strategy. If the position is simple, they don't search. If it's complicated, they can search very, very deep. And here I have two examples. So this is a relatively simple endgame. And if you are a good player, you might actually recognize this game. It's a position taken from a game between Alekhine and Capablanca. And basically, most players are going to play immediately king f3 here. In fact, this endgame is not that trivial. There are still some technical issues. But in this position, basically, that's the only move that's reasonable. So most players will play that without any search. Now consider the second position on the right. So this position is very complicated. Pieces are attacked. This bishop is attacked. This knight is attacked. White might start an attack on the king side. Maybe knight takes g7. So it's very, very complicated. So in this kind of position, start searching very deep, very precisely, and much, much deeper than weaker players. Okay, now how do we acquire these patterns and these search algorithms? Well, practice obviously is a serious candidate, and a lot of research has been done on practice in chess. And part of the motivation for this research is a paper written by Ericsson, Krampe, and Tesch-Romer in 1993, a paper about deliberate practice. And what they propose in the paper is that talent plays little or no role at all in acquiring expertise. They also propose that it takes about 10 years or 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to become an expert. And what they meant by deliberate practice are basically activities that are goal-directed and activities that enable immediate feedback. And they claim that these activities tend to be performed individually, that they are typically effortful and not enjoyable. In their paper, they looked at musicians, pianists, and violinists, and the conclusion clearly was basically that expertise can be explained by deliberate practice only. So with Guillermo Campitelli, who at the time was my PhD student, we collected data about deliberate practice in chess. So we contacted 104 and we asked them to fill in retrospective questionnaires. And the questionnaires were about their practice activities, how much they practiced every year, what kind of activities they were doing, and so on. And I'm going to report only a very, very small part of this research. On average, it took our players about 11,000 hours of deliberate practice to reach master level. So this is not far at all from the 10,000 hours. However, deliberate practice accounted only for about 20% of the variance in skill. This means that 80% are not explained at all. Although what was very striking in the data is that there was a huge variability in the amount of deliberate practice. So, for example, some players took 8 times longer than other master. That would be 3,000 hours against 24,000 hours. And this is really a huge difference. In fact, some players had more than 25,000 hours of practice, but they never made the master. This graph shows the data in some detail. So on the x-axis, we have the accumulated number of hours of deliberate practice. On the y-axis, the percentage of players within each skill group. Expect the masters to be all there, the intermediate players, which were the weaker players of our sample, to be all on the left, and the experts somewhere in the middle. And as you can see, the pattern is not that clear. Of course, some masters practiced a lot, but many of them didn't practice that much at all, especially those here. If you look at the intermediate players, most of them didn't practice that much, but some of them did practice a huge amount of time. And also, the experts, which in theory should be somewhere in the middle, are pretty much all over the place. The conclusion here is that deliberate practice is important, but there are other factors that are necessary to reach expertise, and one of these factors is probably talent. Another very interesting topic is the question of gender differences. And that's a question that is interesting not only for chess, but for domains like science and mathematics. And well, first, many more men play chess than women. In the international rating list, you find only one woman for every 17 men. Also, I think it's fair to say that men are better at chess than women. If you look at the 100 best players, you find only one female player, Wu Yifan, here on the right. She is ranked number 18 L rating of 2658. By comparison, Magnus Carlsen, number 1, has an Elo of 2862. And that's a difference of 1 standard deviation, which is actually quite a lot. How can we explain these differences? Well, there are many, many explanations, and the book does go into some detail on them. I'm just going to very briefly mention them. One of them is a statistical explanation. And the idea is that if you have more men playing chess, by chance, you are going to have more men at the top level. Another class concerns biological explanations. One of them is that men have better visual spatial abilities, and therefore they are better in a game like chess, which is visual spatial. And there are also socio-cultural explanations. For example, the kind of toys that boys and girls are using are going basically to shape their interests and also their cognition. There are actually a few other explanations. Well, one explanation that seems quite powerful to me is that women are less monomaniac. So if you want to be a top player in chess, you need to spend all these hours, at least 10,000 hours, and probably many more. And basically, when you do that, you don't do other things that might be more exciting. You really need to have a total commitment to what you are doing. And the same applies to science and mathematics, I would argue. And basically, you need this kind of totally monomaniac approach to chess. And that was summarized very nicely by Bobby Fischer, who was world champion in 1972. And he basically said that chess is life. And by contrast, Wu Yifan here simply said chess is not life. I think it's a really, really important difference in approach. In fact, it's interesting that if you look at the careers of many strong women grandmasters, many of them actually gave up chess to follow a career, for example, in politics or in science. A very interesting question is the question of style and intuition. And simply, one could argue that there are three main styles. The first one is called style. Basically, one plays the opponent rather than the position. And the classic example of this is Emanuel Lasker, who was a world champion. And Lasker wrote that it is two human beings who fight on the chessboard, not the wooden pieces. And basically what Lasker was trying to do is to play moves that were very unpleasant for the opponent. Objectively, they might not be the best move, but there would be a move that he knew the opponent didn't like at all. The second main style is the positional style. Here, what you play is sound moves that optimize the coordination of pieces. And basically, you try to obtain a very small advantage, and then taking your time, you increase this advantage. This kind of style sometimes can be very boring, but it can be very, very efficient. And a very good example of this is the current world champion Magnus Carlsen, who plays this style where basically nothing happens in the game, nothing interesting, but at the end he wins. And he doesn't care if the game is boring. Well, he has won the game at the end. And the third main style is a combinational style. Here the focus is on direct attacks and tactical ideas. A good example of this is Michael Tal, also a world champion, and he had very dangerous attacks. His play was very sharp. He had very interesting combinations. Very often these combinations were not correct. Basically, you could refute them, but it was very difficult for the opponent to find the defense in real time. If you are interested in my own style, I have this kind of combinational style. Of course, not at the level of Tal. Well, intuition can be defined as the ability to understand a problem rapidly and effortlessly. Of course, this applies outside of chess, for example, in science and medicine. A doctor typically is able to diagnose a common illness very quickly in a matter of seconds, and that's basically what we call intuition. To go back to chess, it's interesting that intuition is present with different styles. So you could have a kind of tactical style that was Tal's style and basically play in an intuitive way. But you can also do that if you have a more positional style. And probably the best explanation to intuition is the explanation proposed by Chase and Simon in the paper I mentioned before. And according to them, intuition can be explained by pattern recognition. So basically, patterns on the board are going to elicit tactical motifs, strategic ideas, and that's going to happen very quickly in an automatic way. And according to them, that's the explanation of. If you remember the small kind of diagram I had with a pattern linked to a possible move, that would be the explanation of intuition, according to Chase and Simon. Now, in spite of all this deliberate practice and intuition, players sometimes make mistakes, and some of these mistakes can be quite shocking. So here we have a game between Petrosian and Bronstein, the Amsterdam candidate tournament in 1956. White played the game very, very well, totally outplayed Black, and White is basically winning. In addition, Bronstein was in a severe time trouble. Bronstein had only a few seconds to play 4 moves. And in this position, Bronstein very quickly played knight f5. The knight attacks the queen here. And now any reasonable move by the queen would basically win the game. However, Petrosian played knight g5. Black knight takes queen. Oops. And White resigned immediately. Exactly what happened, well, we can speculate. Probably Petrosian was totally sure he was winning and basically has lost concentration, which is still amazing that this could happen at the top level in a very important tournament. There's not much scientific research about errors in chess, but one paper I wrote with Merin Bilalic, who also was one of my PhD students, and Peter McLeod, actually addressed this question. And we were interested in the Einstellung effect. So the Einstellung in psychology is the idea that prior knowledge can have a negative effect. And in particular, the first idea that comes to mind is going to prevent alternative being considered. And relating this to Chase and Simon's idea, the idea is that once a familiar situation has triggered a familiar pattern, basically this pattern of thought is going to be very difficult to change. So it might be a relatively good move, but it might not be optimal. And then basically it's very, very difficult to change your mind. And by the way, this is related to the idea of confirmation bias, which is exactly the same idea. Once you have an idea in your mind, it's very hard to change it. And to study the question, we created chess positions where the task was to find the shortest way to checkmate black. And the positions or the problems are two solutions. One was a long familiar solution, and the other one was a short, optimal, but less familiar solution. And I'm going to give you an example now. So here the task is to checkmate, and you have to find the quickest way to checkmate, and white is playing first. Now, if you are a good player, you have seen the solution very quickly, and at least the long familiar solution. So the first move is to move the queen here, checking the king. So check here. The king goes here, and by the way, I'm going to show you only the main line. The knight comes here, and again, the knight attacks the king, so there's a check. The king goes to g8. The knight goes here, and there's a double check. The queen is attacking, and the knight is attacking the king. And now you get these very neat moves. You go here with the queen. Black can take the queen, but it's not a blunder this time, because white can play knight f7, and that's a checkmate. It's called a smothered mate, because the black king is basically cannot move because of his own pieces. And it took 5 white moves to reach this position. Now let's go back to the starting position. There is in fact another solution, a solution that's quicker. So I'll give you again a few seconds to try to find it. And I can even tell you that it's going to be checkmate in the 3 moves. The first move is the same as before. Black plays the same. And now, instead of checking with the knight, we go here with the queen. And basically, we are attacking the pawn here on h7 and the pawn on g7. And it's impossible for black to protect both. And there is no way to counterattack the white king, which is very safe here. And let's say black plays this to protect this square. And now we checkmate by taking this pawn, and this is only 3 moves. So we gave this problem and a few other problems like this to strong players. We had international masters, and these people are basically 5 standard deviations above the mean. We also have masters, 4 standard deviations above the mean, and candidate masters, 3 standard deviations above the mean. All the players found the familiar solution very, very quickly, but of course we are interested in the optimal solution, the checkmate in 3 moves, and that turned out very difficult. For example, only 50% of the international masters found the optimal solution. Only 18% of the masters found the optimal solution, and 0% of the candidate masters. And as I told you before, the candidate masters are pretty good players. Some of them are chess professionals, and of course the masters and the international masters are even better. Now you could say, well, maybe something is very special about this optimal solution. Maybe it's very hard. So what we did is to have a control position, which we gave to another group of players of similar level. And what we did is to move the bishop that was here in the original position. We moved it here, And now the bishop is controlling this f7 square, and there is no checkmate anymore with the smothered mate. So only the short optimal solution is possible. And in this case, everybody found the optimal solution. So it wasn't the case that there was something particularly difficult about this one solution problem, or this optimal solution in the two-solution problem. It was really that finding the familiar solution was blocking the solution to the optimal solution. We also collected data with weaker players, class C players who are average players, class B, 1 standard deviation above, the class C and class A players, 2 standard deviation above. We didn't give them the two-solution problem because even the candidate masters couldn't find the optimal solution here. We gave them only the one solution and problem, and we obtained these results. And what is very interesting is that if you compare the two-solution problem with the very strong players with the one-solution problem with the weak players or weaker players, you pretty much find that the international master plays at the same level in the two-solution problem as the class A players in the one-solution problem. And you get the same pattern with the master and class B players and candidate master and class C players. So basically what happens is that if you are in a situation of Einstellung, basically your skill level is going to go down by 3 standard deviations. And that's a huge difference in skill. So this Einstellung effect is a very, very powerful effect. Now, in the two-solution problem, all players told us that they were trying to find the shorter solution after we told them that there was a shorter solution, but that they failed to do so. So what we did is to collect eye movements with the kind of apparatus I showed before. And here the results were very, very clear and rather surprising. Basically, all these players, in that case, they were all the candidate masters, even though they were telling you that they were looking at other solutions, in fact, if you look at their eyes, they were looking at the moves that were critical for the old solution. So they never looked at the squares or the moves that were important for. So that's very strong evidence that the Einstellung effect happens at a very perceptual level. And of course, all this is totally unconscious. I'm sure many of you are interested in the question of training. You want to be better at chess. And the book discusses that in some detail. I'm just going to very briefly make a few points. But in my view, the most important is tactics. Chess is basically a tactical game. And if your tactics are not very good, you are going to struggle. So even though you know the openings very well, you play the middle game very well, if you don't master your tactics, basically you are going to blunder at some point, and you're not going to see a very cheap combination and lose the game. So I would say spend a lot of time looking at tactics. And this is both doing loads of exercises, but also reading books about tactics that tell you what are the main motives and some ideas about how to find combinations, how to check them, and so on. Of course, you need to know about strategy, else you always reach very bad positions, which is no fun. You also need to learn about endgames. So these are positions with very few pieces on the board. This is a very kind of technical part of the game. Of course, you cannot know everything that there is to know about endgames, but there are some typical endgames that you should know because they recur very, very often. You should also learn a little bit about openings. My advice is basically to specialize in the kind of openings you are likely to play. This being said, don't spend all your time on openings. In fact, most players spend really openings, because don't forget what I said about tactics in particular, but also strategy and games. Also, I think it's very important to study classic games. And in fact, in the diagrams I've shown before, there were a few examples of classic games. And one reason is that these classic games tend to be easier to understand than modern or current games. And this is because people didn't defend that well before. And so the idea of the game basically came across in the game itself. Nowadays, the level of defending is very high, and because of this, the themes are kind of very hidden in variations and sub-variations. And of course, you should play competitive games, but if you really want to progress, competitive games are not the most important, I would say. Of course, you need to play some of them, but you need to do all the things I mentioned before. Now I'm going to briefly describe a method which is not very well known, but that I find very useful in my own career. So this method, which I call the spiral method, is to study openings in a way that basically directly connect them to endgames. So here, for example, we have a position from the diamond of defense of the Sicilian opening, and actually diamond of variation of the Sicilian opening. And black is playing, and of course, you could try to understand the tactics of the position. But the idea of the spiral method is to try to understand what would happen. So to do that, you simply remove everything except the pawns and the kings. And basically, you play this kind of endgame. And that could very well occur in the game. And you can play that against yourself, against friends, or you can use computers. And basically, you play this endgame many times. You try to understand the tactics, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of each position, what are the plan that each side should have. Same thing, the different type of endgame, for example, rook endgame, very, very common endgame. And again, you play this kind of endgame with this so-called pawn structure. And then you can do, of course, the same thing with a different type of endgame. And if you do that, not only are you going to improve your skills in endgame, but also you are going to be able to connect basically the opening to the endgame. And then when you analyze the position, even in the opening, you know that a certain type of endgame is not very good for you, or is good for you. And also, if by chance you reach this specific endgame or something not too far in a real game, you will have a huge advantage over your opponent because you have in fact studied this specific position already. Now, many chess players and in particular researchers argue that chess is a magic bullet of a variety of problems. And here I'm going to talk only about one of these problems, which is education. And the idea here is that if you teach children to play chess, they are going to be more intelligent. They are going to improve their skills in mathematics and a few other things like this. In fact, it's a very, very common view. A lot of research is devoted to this theme. Every year, there are several conferences only about chess and education. And this is obviously the question of transfer. So transfer is the idea that abilities developed in one domain can be used in another domain. And it's common to differentiate between near transfer and far transfer. Near transfer is the idea that transfer is going to happen to a similar domain. So for example, you learn algebra and you apply this to calculus, or you apply the skills you have developed with algebra to calculus. And both are about mathematics, so you stay in the similar domain. And with far transfer, the transfer is to a non-similar domain. So for example, you learn Latin, and for some reason you hope that knowing Latin is going to make you better in mathematics. Obviously, the research on chess is related to far transfer, so you learn chess, and then you hope that by learning chess, you are better in mathematics, for example. Now, if you want to study this question, this is the correct experimental design. You should have an experimental group, for example, chess, an active control group, which does an exciting activity other than chess, and you need an active control group to control for placebo effects. And also you need a passive control group, which does nothing special, business as usual. Now, rather surprisingly, this design is very rarely used in the chess research, in spite of a lot of research, as I mentioned before. My former PhD student, Giovanni Sala, used this kind of these two experiments. In the first experiments, we had 52 children, fourth graders, and the active control task was the Asian game of Go. And in the second experiment, we had 233 fourth and third graders, and the active control group, active control task was checkers. And we had a pre-test and a post-test, which were about mathematical problem-solving abilities and metacognitive skills. We randomly assigned the classes to each of the three groups, just to repeat either chess lessons, lessons about Go in the first experiment, or checkers in the second experiment, or for the passive control group, regular school activities. And the results were very disappointing. There was basically no evidence of far transfer. Another theme that's quite common in the literature is that playing chess has costs. One very common topic is to make a link between chess and madness. You find that in many movies and many fiction books. It's also a very common theme in the psychoanalytical literature. There are several books about this. In particular, Bronstein, who used to be one of the top players in the world, psychoanalyst, and he wrote a book about the psychology of the chess player, and the book is really an application of the ideas of Freud to what is thought was the link between chess and madness. And by the way, you get the same hypothesis, which is called the mad genius hypothesis, to explain creativity in the arts, for example, in music and painting. Now, Fine and the people who defend this view use a few classical examples, and I'm going to mention. The first one is Paul Morphy, born in 1837 and died in 1884. Now, Morphy had a very interesting career. For 3 years, during 3 years, he totally dominated the chess world. However, he stopped playing chess at the age of 22. And what is very fascinating is that, in addition to basically destroying every the chess, he also totally changed the understanding of chess. And according to Fine, the reason why Morphy stopped playing chess is because he suffered from paranoia. The other classic example is Bobby Fischer, born in 1943 and who died in 2008. He was world champion in 1972. According to Fine, Fischer displayed several symptoms of paranoia. For example, after his win in 1972, he withdrew from chess for 20 years and then played only one match again. He displayed a rather strong hatred of Jews. He also accused the Soviets of cheating against him, but also against other Western players. And also he constantly complained about the play conditions. Now, it's interesting to note that recent research, in fact, has shown that Soviets, in fact, cheated against Fischer. There is an interesting paper doing some statistical analysis. And in fact, they cheated not only against Fischer, but also against other Western players. And nowadays, most chess players are very grateful to Fischer. because his complaints about the conditions of playing have really improved these conditions, and in particular with respect to the money that players receive for playing or for winning tournaments. In any case, these are the kind of argument that Fine is using to argue that Fischer suffered from paranoia. My own view is that the mad genius hypothesis is almost certainly a myth. And one reason is that the data that are used are of very poor quality scientifically. They are basically anecdotes, press reports, etc. Also, there is no formal clinical assessment. So Fine never made a clinical assessment of Fischer, for example. And also, there is no consideration of base rates. And the question here is whether the rate of psychiatric disorders is higher in chess than in the general population. So if you get the same rate in chess than in the general population, basically there is nothing to explain. And until you show that the rate is higher in chess, which might or might not be the case, then basically you cannot really talk about this mad genius hypothesis. Okay, it's time to end this talk, and I'm going to very briefly summarize some of the key ideas. Well, first I'm going to argue that the first four topics that I've talked about are fairly well understood scientifically. And these are perception, memory, decision-making, and learning and practice. And also I'm going to argue that much less is known about the other topics. Some of them have received some research, but others have received no research at all. And I would claim that chess psychology is a very active domain of research, and also that it's likely to remain so in the future. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was an interesting talk. Now we'll move on to questions and answers. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. So thank you, Professor. That was really interesting. I actually learnt a lot and had a lot of my theories sort of confirmed or debunked. But yeah, I found that really interesting. We have some questions prior to this, and let me just grab them. And this is just. So these questions aren't going to be based around your talk, but we will be taking questions in from the comments of the live stream. So if you guys watching want to ask questions, now's your time to ask them in the chat, and we'll get to that. So the first question is, how was it playing Spassky, Kasparov, and Anand? And how did you come about playing them? And then what did you prepare when you play against, I guess, any opponent in a competition and tournament?
Okay, yeah, first playing against these big players. Yeah, that was a different experience in 3 times. I drew actually against Anand, and although I was losing at the beginning, I was winning at the end, so I could have beaten the world champion, but I drew one, which is nice. In that time, Anand was still young. He was, I think, 18 years old. But he was already very, very strong. Well, here, because he was not yet a world champion in sense, there was nothing special. I mean, everybody knew he was very strong, but I've played other strong players. The game was very eventful. Then there was the game against Spassky. In that case, well, I played 5 games against him. I lost 5 times, which was a bit painful. And the first game was in a normal tournament, and the 4 other games were 30-minute games. In the first game, that was a tournament in Italy, and of course, against him, against any other opponent, you prepare the game before the tournament, a few weeks or months before. You study what they are playing and try to find weaknesses. Of course, when you play Spassky, there are not many weaknesses, but at least you try to find the kind of openings they play and so on. And in fact, I had a winning position against Spassky. At the end of the opening, if I'd played the right move, I could have won. And that was kind of interesting because I thought about the key move for like 3 or 4 moves, and it didn't work for whatever reason. And then at the specific moment, exact moment where I didn't look at this move, the move was in fact winning. Maybe not totally winning, but I would have got a very, very strong position. So that was disappointing. And then my chess club in Switzerland called Fribourg organized a match, Spassky against me, because they were celebrating, I think, 100 years of history of the club. And I thought it would be fun for me to play against Spassky, and it turned out not to be really fun, because I thought he wouldn't take that too seriously and at least give me a draw, but he went for the kill for every game. And the first, I think, 2 games were quite reasonable, but then totally collapsed. Wow. And well, if you look at the games, actually, he really played the Carlson kind of style, just play for a small advantage, and then you realize that well, he's much, much better. In fact, the 2 things about this. The first one is there are some players who are able basically to play these 3 main styles, and Spassky is one of them. So basically, depending on the opponent, he would play something very tactical or psychological or positional. So of course, he looked at my games. He realized that tactically, I'm dangerous. I'm not perfect, but I can be dangerous. Psychologically, well, he thought this guy is a psychologist. Don't even think about it. And then he realized that positionally, he had no clue at all. So he went for that and basically that way. And that's one of the points where I thought maybe I should stop playing chess, do something else like psychology. And the second point is the game against Kasparov. So that was very special because he played against the national Swiss team in the Simon. So he played against 6 players at the same time, the 6 best players. And well, we were pretty strong, as good as him, but still we were good players. And before the match, we had decided that we would play every game to the end. So in chess, there are ways to finish the game very quickly with a draw, so nobody is winning. And also in chess, white has an advantage. So we thought that Kasparov would try to draw the games where he had black. He would try to draw these games very quickly and try to win the games where he had white. And in fact, it's what he did. Except that he didn't need to do that because he totally destroyed us. He won 5.5 to 1.5. And in my own game, I basically had no chance at all because, of course, he had studied my games in great detail. In fact, for each player, he had made a kind of description of the strengths and the weaknesses. And obviously, there were not many strengths, but many weaknesses. So in my case, he thought I was very weak in the openings. I was very dangerous tactically, dangerous in the complicated positions, and not okay, but not great in positional play, and games okay, but not great. But my big weakness, he thought, was the opening. And so for me, he decided to play an opening which was very complicated, but at the stage of the opening, because he knew that basically, I don't know, maybe I was too lazy to prepare this kind of thing, so I didn't have the good approach. So in fact, he played the variation that he had prepared to play against Karpov, the World Championship. And after he told me that he had spent like 1 week studying this variation, not only himself, but with the grandmasters and so on. And in fact, I could have repeated the moves. So if you repeat the moves, you have a draw. So I could have repeated the moves and made a draw and enjoy my afternoon. But because I had agreed that we would play every game, I decided to play, and then I entered into this variation and basically in a sense, it was not a game because I entered something else. It was impossible to compute that on the board, especially for me, and I was destroyed. And also, after we looked at all the games, and then I realized that Kasparov was really playing a different game. And that's the only time I realized that. Spassky, for example, of course, he was very strong, but you had the impression that maybe one day you could play more or less at this level. Arnold definitely, well, he was making mistakes and so on. Kasparov, he was on a different planet. And so basically, he analyzed all our games. And the impression was that the point where we stop anticipating the moves. So before the talk, I talked about this look-ahead search. So when we stopped anticipating because it was too deep and too complicated for us, that's the point where we started. And where things became interesting. And of course, for each analysis like me, and that was very hard for all the players. And most of the games, he won them the way he thought he would win them. So yeah, Kasparov was definitely on a different planet. Now, I don't know so much about the new generations of players. I would expect players like Caruana or Carlson are at the same level, but there was something special about Kasparov. Wow. So of course, that's the second time where I decided that I should do something else.
Wow, that was wow. I can't imagine playing 3 world champions and like, I think it's incredible. There's a question here. Yeah, wait, Ivan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, well, I feel that one of the qualities of strong players is that, especially the really strong, they always find really good moves to put you under pressure, even if you are in a really good position. And that's what makes it very hard to play against them. And if you make one mistake, then they will exploit it for sure. And that's how they beat other strong players, or maybe not quite as strong as them. Right.
Yeah, that's definitely a characteristic of the top level players. Well, partly because even if they don't pattern recognition, they are going to play a good move almost all the time. But in addition, they are going to do better than just playing a good move. They are going to play a move that they know, well, either it's the best move in the position or it's a move that is very difficult to handle. But again, there are differences in this. Like some players, like Carlson, is not going to play moves that are particularly unpleasant for you. You just play the normal move. You need to try to understand the mind of the opponent and try to find a move that is going to be very unpleasant for the opponent. But the level now in chess is very, very high, partly due to computers, mostly due to computers. And all the good players really play good moves almost most of the time. It's fascinating when you look at the games online where you get the evaluation by a computer. I don't know if you look at Topalov playing against, Kamsky. Their moves are always within the 3 best moves, nearly always. And of course, sometimes they make a blunder, but what is amazing is this ability to play good moves almost all the time. I think the quality is much higher now, partly because if you practice with a computer, and of course, all these players practice with computers now, you can play games very quickly, or you can look at games very, very quickly. And basically, you can create these patterns much quicker than if you look at the games yourself. So when I was a professional, if I wanted to study a game, I had to take a physical board and open the book and then find the right page. And because I had many books, it wasn't obvious which book I should open and which page I should look at. And then I had to move the pieces on the board. If I wanted to go back, I had to start again. And all this took a lot of time. And now with computers, you can do that automatically. So I think computers have brought 2 main advantages. If you study the games of other people, you can go through them very, very quickly. And by the way, Kasparov was one of the first players doing that. When he trained against the Swiss national team, That's kind of why he was preparing, looking at databases. And also, of course, you can play against computers. You can ask computers to analyze your games and try to find mistakes and so on. And by the way, to go back to Kasparov, this match against the Swiss national team is not the only one he played. He played against several national teams, and he beat them all, except the first match where he didn't prepare well. So just to tell you how good he was. And one of the matches was against the team of Israel. And there were 4 grandmasters. And I think the 4 of them were very close to 2,600. And he won the match. So it's just incredible.
Wow. How important do you think ELO ratings are in assessing the strength of your opponent and, the psychology? Because I heard somewhere that apparently, like, if someone with like a 200, like ELO rating higher than 200 than their opponent has like a 90% chance of winning or something.
Yeah, well, this is correct. Actually, it's 76% of winning if there are 200 points. So, by the way, the difference between Uifan and Carlsen was 200 points. So Carlsen would win 76% of the games, or 100 games. So the ELO rating is a very good measure, assuming that you play many games. If you play only 1 or 2 games, it's not reliable. But if you play, I would say, 50 or 100 games in a year, it's very, very reliable. So if somebody has a higher ELO and both players play many games, you can pretty much predict the outcome. Of course, it's a probabilistic prediction. It doesn't mean that you cannot win the game, but it means that on average the player is better. Mm-hmm. Now, if you play against strong opponents, my advice is to play openings you know very well, and particularly obscure openings that are rarely played at the top level. I mean, you don't want to play things which are too bad, because if it's too bad, the opponent is going to find the weakness. But if you play openings that have some kind of official refutation, but to refute the line, you have to learn a 20 pages of so-called theory, it's very likely that the opponent doesn't know that. And basically, in addition to using your own knowledge, so basically creating a position where you can use your own patterns, you create a position where the opponent is not likely to use their own patterns. So I know several examples where amateurs have beaten strong players, and very often it's in this kind of obscure openings, gambits and so on. In particular, in these cases, if you don't play the best move, you can be in big trouble. And because at Grandmaster level, basically, you never play these kind of openings that typically are forgotten about what to do. Of course, you cannot always do that. And the Grandmasters are smart and they try to avoid these kind of things. So they are going to play some kind of boring moves at the beginning just to avoid these kind of things. But if you play a strong opponent, not only Grandmaster, of course, somebody stronger than you, especially much stronger, try to go into these positions. In general, you should go into the positions that you know, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just one more question from the Google Forms before we move on to the questions for the live stream. I found this question really interesting. So what do you think is the most important predictor of chess skill? So what non-chess attribute is the best predictor of how good you will be at chess? If there is such a thing.
Yeah, there are some predictors. None of them is that great, but still they would predict. So the first one is intelligence. So the people who play chess, on average, are more intelligent than people who do not play chess. So congratulations to you.
A round of applause for everyone.
Of course, this is only on average, but still the difference is quite important. Also, within the people who play chess, the more intelligent you are, the better you tend to be. Again, this is statistical, it's far from perfect, but that's one way to predict whether somebody is going to be a good chess player. There is another factor which, again, doesn't predict that much, actually, much less than the intelligence, which is kind of fun. This is handedness. So people who use their left hand or both hands tend to be better at chess. That well, I have to be precise here. If you compare people who play chess and people who do not play chess, the people who play chess tend to be more often either left-handed or ambidextrous. So, and the difference in the general population, about 12% are non-right-hander, so either ambidextrous or left-handed. In chess players, the percentage is about 18%. So it's not a massive difference, but still there's one difference. And there's another predictor, which is even more surprising. And this is, again, differentiating between people who play chess and people who do not play chess. So people who play chess, and people who play chess in the study, these were people who had at least 2,000 elo points, so expert players and above. So these people tend to be born more often between January and June than the population. So I was born in February, so I fit the prediction. Of course, there are many exceptions. Like Kasparov, I think, was born in November. But again, statistically, that would be a predictor. So if you put everything together, intelligence, the month of birth, and handedness, you could predict a little bit, but it's far from perfect.
Wow.
Well, I said that deliberate practice is not the entire story. It's still a very good predictor. So I can tell you that even if you are very smart and you are born in February and you are left-handed, you won't be a chess player if you never studied openings or endgames or tactics. I'm pretty sure about that.
Ivan, when were you born?
Yeah, moving on. Yeah. I have another question. How important is psychology in your own game? Did you use it when you were playing? And do you think that it gave you any sort of an advantage?
No, I don't think so. But at some point in my life, like roughly between 24 and 28, so the last 4 years where I played chess, I tried sometimes to add a bit of psychology, but it never really helped. In fact, it was distracting, because when I was thinking about psychology, I didn't think about the moves my opponent could play, which was not very good. And I think in order to do that, I mean, of course, I could give you examples where this worked quite well, but on average, it didn't really work. I think you need a level which is higher than my own level. Probably you need, I would say very roughly 2600 to be able to play with the psychology of the player, because you have to basically master technical aspects, tactical aspects, and so on very well. Again, there are examples where even weak players can play with a bit of psychology, but I wouldn't advise people to try to do that. It's much better to go for to play on the board.
I see. And moving on to something which is a bit rare but can be very costly. What do you think is the best way to approach a must-win or a must-draw game? Because I've heard of cases, in fact, I have my own experiences where I only needed a draw and I played passively and I lost. And there are some examples of grandmasters doing the exact same thing. So what do you think is the best way to approach such a game?
Okay, that's a very good question. I was never good at that, actually. And in fact, what I did at the end is just to play a normal game. Because if I tried to play a passive position to get a draw, well, basically I would get in the kind of position I didn't like, and I would lose. Well, if you know a lot of opening theory, you might choose a line that is more likely to draw, but that you need a very high level to do that. And I remember that actually in the tournament where I drew against Fernand, at the end, what was it? Yeah, I could have made, well, I think I made a norm for an international master, and I just played a normal game. I think I made the norm in that tournament. I'm not quite sure, but I remember that Anand complained that I didn't play, that I played the wrong kind of opening, that I should have played something much quieter. No, actually it's much later. In another tournament much later, Anand was playing again, and I could have made a Grandmaster norm, so much higher. And I lost the game, so I didn't make the norm. And Anand said, "You idiot, why didn't you play, I don't know, a Slav defense, and then you are sure to make a draw?" And the fact is that I couldn't do it because I knew nothing about Slav. So the Slav defense. So basically, the only openings I knew were very tactical openings. So there was something basically wrong in my openings, partly because I was studying psychology and doing other things at the time. But so it's not that easy to do a Grandmaster draw because you need to know openings very well. But you cannot play only the wrong openings, then you're in trouble in winning. So you need to know quite a lot of things. It's a huge investment of time. So unless you have a lot of time studying openings, my advice is just to play what you normally play, which didn't work, I guess, but one question.
Still good advice nonetheless. So this is a question, the next question we have is about your presentation. So someone says that they really, they found the explanation of chunks really interesting. And then you mentioned that to attain master level knowledge of 50,000 chunks is the key number. And so what kind of methodology went into finding that number?
Okay, that's a very good question. So I mentioned that Chase and Simon research was very influential, and in fact, many studies were carried out after. So there are at least, I would say, 50 papers only on the question of chunking and related questions. And that, by the way, was not only about chess, but in other domains. In fact, if you look at other domains, you get even more papers. Now, the methodology is was quite complicated. Well, first, they collected data where they kind of recorded the eye movements of the players when they were reconstructing the position. And they tried to look at, well, basically they had a task where the player would copy a position. So they could look at the target, and they were copying the target on another board. And every time they look at the target, they decided, Chase and Simon decided that basically a new chunk would start. So if I put a few pieces, I look at the target board, I put a few other pieces, that's the start of a new chunk. And then they look at some statistical properties of the pairs of pieces that were put together, either when you look at the copy board or when you just put them together. And there were some differences, like if they are put together very quickly, there are many more relations of attack, defense, proximity, and so on. If you look at the board, you tend to have relatively few such relations. And also the timing was important. So within a chunk, if you place one chunk back, you place the pieces very quickly, typically quicker than 2 seconds. And when you start a new chunk, definitely when you look at the target, you use more than two seconds. So basically, Chase and Simon use a variety of techniques, and they kind of triangulate all these techniques. And then the 50,000 numbers, in fact, is based on the mathematical modeling and also computer modeling. And basically, Simon and colleagues, including me, wrote computer programs that would acquire chunks. And then you estimate how many chunks you need to reach the level of recall that you find in the experiment. It's quite a long story, but the methodology is quite complicated. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I said you need 50,000 chunks to become a master, which is true. I didn't want to scare you too much, because if you want to become a grandmaster, it's probably 500,000.
Well, great. Yeah.
Right. So moving on. One very important question nowadays is that a lot of people ask is that how can we get more women to play chess? Because there are relatively few women in chess. Why is it that there are not more women playing chess? given that the world is becoming more progressive and gender norms are becoming more blurred, why is it that there aren't so many women playing chess?
Yeah, this is a very important question. In fact, every year there is a conference in London about typically chess in school, but every year they also talk about other things. And I think 2 years ago the question was about gender differences. And of course the question is how can you attract more women? But in a sense there are many women at the beginning. If you look at children of age 10, there are as many boys as girls playing chess. But the problem is more about retention. Now, first, the first question is maybe women have a good reason not to play chess. That is, if they want to do a career in science or other things, that's their choice. So there's no reason to kind of force them to play chess. But still, it's probably true that it's not that easy to play chess at a very high level if you're a woman. I think chess is a bit of a macho world. There are so many men, so basically it's a male culture and tends to be a bit macho. For example, if you look at the kind of jokes and so on, if you go to the internet and play games, you get some pretty nasty jokes, and that obviously is going to turn off women. So several ideas have been proposed. One of them is basically to increase the money that women receive, which makes sense. So if they would be paid more, they're more likely to play. Well, in some sports, in fact, men and women receive the same amount of money, which is not the case in chess, far not. So that could be one idea. Maybe you should develop training techniques which are more adapted to women. I'm not really an expert in that, but that would be the kind of things I would propose. Probably increasing money is a good idea. Where it's a bit tricky, I think it's a bad idea to have women play their own tournaments, which is still very common. So really, if you want, well, there are two questions in a sense. The question is whether you want to move the level of women in chess. The second question is whether you want to retain them. So for the first question, of course, women would have to play in the same tournaments as men, because if you want to improve, you have to play against better players. That's totally obvious. And in fact, players like Judith Polgar, who used to be the best female player, or Wu Fan, they prefer playing tournaments with the men because they are just better and they learn more. So you should encourage female players to play in the mixed tournaments. But of course, if they play in mixed tournament, they are less likely to win prizes, unless you give special prizes for women, which is probably the best way to do it.
I see. Do you think it's likely we'll see a female world champion in our lifetime?
Do you mean a kind of
mixed tournament? Yeah.
Actually, I don't.
Oh.
Sorry.
It's okay.
There are some. Here I'm going to be a bit politically incorrect, but I think there are some biological differences. It's not the entire story. Maybe it's only a small part of the story. But men, for example, are more aggressive, and you find that very early with children. I think there is good evidence that there are biological differences, and I think women can get very high levels. Well, Wu Fan is an example. Judith Polgar, the best, I think she was number 5 or 6. So this is clearly possible. I think at the top level, World Championship, everything has to be optimized, and I don't think so. Well, I hope I'm wrong. I'd be very happy to be shown to be wrong, but I don't expect it. And also, don't forget the argument that I made in the talk that, in a sense, women are smarter than men. So women realize that there are more exciting things than pushing a knight bishop on the board.
I'll accept that. Yeah. Also, do you think it could be because you mentioned that to be an expert at something, you need to practice individually, and it's not fun at all. It's quite.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's because maybe just like from my own experience, it's just learning chess and then memorizing all the moves and theory is just not something that a woman would want to do
What you're
because.
talking about, it's very exciting. The 28th move of the Najdorf variation. No, okay, that's a good question. But there is actually a lot of literature about that because this deliberate practice framework has been applied not only to chess but many other sports and science and so on. And that's one aspect of the theory which is probably not correct. For example, in sport, even in swimming, many experts are in fact enjoy practicing. Swimmers really are very happy to be alone in the swimming pool and swim for 2 hours. They just enjoy that. And you find that in football as well. So many, for example, there was an interview with Beckham where he said he really enjoyed practicing. And in many sports, you find that people really enjoy practicing. So that's probably it's probably incorrect. Even in chess, some people really enjoy practicing. There's also the question of whether it's better to practice individually or in groups. The theory clearly predicts that deliberate practice has to be individual. But again, if you look at the data, in many domains, it's not the case. In many sports, the practice is in group. And even in chess, in the data I collected with Guillermo Campitelli, in fact, people spend more time practicing in group than individually. So I think that aspect of the theory is incorrect. The idea is reasonable. The idea is that if you practice individually, it's easier for a coach to identify your weaknesses and then to correct them because they can give you feedback very quickly and precisely. But again, in many domains, this is not necessary, apparently.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, I just want to ask something about deliberate practicing, because at least from my experience and probably from yours as well, I didn't feel that practicing chess was difficult or a chore. I found it actually quite enjoyable. And actually that differs from like some other experiences that I had regarding other things like studying, where it felt more like an obligation. And I was actually studying chess and it felt more enjoyable. So could it be that chess might be more enjoyable for men? Could that be another explanation in a way?
Yeah, that could be an explanation, but I definitely know some women who enjoy practicing. Of course, there are many things you can practice in chess, and some people prefer doing a few things than others. But I know very many players who just enjoy doing anything with the chess, and the harder, the better in a sense. I wanted to make another point, which I forgot. Give me 1 second. So, in fact, one reason why some people really enjoy practicing is that they reach what's called the state of flow. So the state of flow is that you are so taken by what you are doing that you forget about anything else in the world. So you forget to eat, to sleep, and so on and so forth. And clearly, often when I was practicing chess, I would forget about anything else. In fact, the 28th move in the Najdorf variation, maybe not the Najdorf variation, the Belloni, was the only meaning not only of my life, but of the universe. So that would be, I was totally taken by that, and basically I would forget about anything else. And you find that in scientific research as well. If you study a question and it's very interesting, you forget about anything else. So this phenomenon of flow is where basically when you are totally concentrated on a topic, you forget about time, space, everything, and it's very enjoyable. So I think many people enjoy studying chess because they reach this phenomenon of flow.
And to follow up on that, is there a way that we can enter this state of flow, even if we don't necessarily enjoy the certain subject?
Yeah, that's I would say it's something which is spontaneous, so you cannot really say now enter this state. There are probably individual differences. Some people are more likely to enter this kind of state. Probably people who are more introvert are more likely. If you are somebody very extrovert, I can see it's a bit harder to enter this state of flow, though you might do it. I think I would say the condition for this is to reach a pretty good level. I mean, you don't need to be Grandmaster, but you need to reach a level where, well, first you have the impression that you master the topic to some extent. You can pose difficult problems and you can try to solve them. It's actually related to the idea of control in psychology. So you want to control your environment, and because the normal environment is very hard to control, you create your own kind of micro environment, which is challenging but not too challenging, and then you can control this environment, and probably you get a lot of reward for that. Yeah, there is a link between domains like music, mathematics, and chess. But part of the link is that in all these domains you can reach this phenomenon of flow. Also, one link is that in all these domains you get very quick feedback. So in chess, if you make a bad move, your opponent is going to punish you, or even if you analyze by yourself, you get the feedback straight away. In music, if you play a wrong note, of course, you knew it. In mathematics, if there's something wrong in your proof, you cannot continue. And typically, this is very, very quick. And also, it could be argued that many people who are very good in these domains are people who have a high level of anxiety. So basically, they use these domains as a way to control their anxiety or diminish their anxiety. And the final point is that all these domains are very addictive. So if you play music, and the same, by the way, applies also to video games, I would say. If you play music or play chess, you cannot stop. I don't know if you play chess online, if you play speed chess or bullet chess, it's incredibly addictive. And I think it is addictive because, well, you can reach, in fact, this level of flow, but also you get the feedback very, very quick. And the most dangerous is when you play an opponent who is at the same level as you. If your opponent is much better, you keep losing and you give up. If you are much better, it's boring to win. If you have an opponent which is at the same level, then things are uncertain, you can control them, but not totally, and then you can spend hours and hours playing.
Great. Moving back to your presentation, this was a question from earlier. So, do you think some openings, like the unconventional ones, would impact your opponent? Like if you play like a weird, obscure gambit that people haven't seen before, do you think an opponent would be affected or sort of like destabilized?
Yeah, that's a very broad question. Well, first it depends on the kind of game you're playing. If you play speed chess, kind of real openings can be annoying, but after a while probably get used to it. But let's talk mostly about normal games. Well, of course, it depends if the opponent knows this kind of real opening. So if they know it, then basically it's going to have no effect at all. If they don't know it, it can be annoying. Now, of course, some of these real openings are very cheeky and almost insulting. So basically, you can play moves that are in fact bad. And basically, you challenge the opponent to refute them, and that clearly can have an effect. And there are two very famous examples at the top level of that. The first one is a game between Karpov and Miles ages ago, where after Karpov's e4, Miles played a6. And Miles, he was a strong grandmaster, but he was much weaker than Karpov. Miles won the game with black. And probably Karpov was annoyed. I mean, a6 is not that bad, actually. It's not insulting, but still, it's a bit insulting. You are the world champion and your opponent is playing that. So probably psychologically, and we go back to this kind of psychological warfare, Miles kind of scored a point here. And the other example is a more recent game between Carlson and Adams. And Adams against e4, if I remember correctly, played g5, or he played h6 first and then g5. And this is really insulting, because g5 is really, really bad. But at the same time, it's not, it's playable. I mean, 20 or 30 years ago, everybody would have said it's totally unplayable. Openings with computers, you realize that, well, it's not great, but it's playable and it can be a bit dangerous. And that was really insulting for Carlson. And actually, Adams won the game. Not because of the opening, but again, I think he scored a point in the opening, saying that, I don't know what you would try to say, something like, well, I'm not afraid of you, I can even play g5. It's well, I've been in this situation a few times. Yeah, it's a bit annoying. Basically, the best is to ignore it, but it's not that easy.
The best response is to win.
Well, that's the best response, of course.
And also, do you have any recommendations on tactical study methods? So, like, would you say like reading books or electronic puzzles or visualizing on a physical board, like out of any other alternative, and what are the differences?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first you definitely need to know the basics. Basically, by reading books, probably you can have access now to videos or digital information, but you need to follow some tutorials. Some books are quite good about that. So basically, they introduce a new theme like the fork. They explain what it is, and then they give you examples. And then you have to do many exercises. The first ones are trivial, and it becomes harder and harder. There are several books which are quite good. Like there's I think, a book called the Encyclopedia of Openings. It's quite advanced, but you get like, I don't know, more than 1,000 puzzles, probably more than that. And you want the problems not to be always at the same level. So you want to start simple because you need to understand the key ideas, and then you want to be more challenging. There was a very good book by a guy called Einstellung. I'm not sure it's in English, read it in Russian at the time, which was doing that, and it was really, really good. But there are many, many books like this. So my advice is to pick up some of these books and basically read them from page 1 to the last page. Then using, the kind of things you find online is okay. I mean, there are many sites that propose problems and you have to find the solution. You have to make sure that you are always challenged. If you realize that the hardest problems are too easy for you, then you need to find something else. And then you should, of course, try to... so far, I was talking about relatively simple positions. So you typically can solve them in maybe 5 minutes maximum, sometimes some of them in 20 seconds. But you should also look at more complicated positions and then spend 10 or 20 minutes trying to think about the position. There's a famous book called Think Like a Grandmaster by Kotov. Now, part of the psychological theory he's using is totally wrong, but practically it's a very, very good book. And if you can read that book, it's definitely useful. Something I don't recommend, that some people recommend, is to play blindfold. So some people recommend basically to practice playing blindfold. So blindfold is playing a game without looking at the board. So we can play a game together. I say e4, you tell me, I don't know, e6, knight f3, keep going. And because in chess you have this algebraic notation, players basically can communicate very easily doing that. But most strong players can play blindfold. Grandmasters can play several games at the same time. In fact, I think my own record is 8 games blindfold. I was very good in that time. I hardly can play one game now. But anyway, I think this is more kind of a side effect of all the knowledge you have acquired. And I don't think, especially at the beginning, that you should practice blindfold. Okay, when you are at, I don't know, international master level, you can argue a little bit, but below that, I wouldn't do that. I think it's more important to practice a lot. Also, try to think in different types of positions and so on. And if you, I mean, somebody, I forgot their names, actually has written a book about basically using the Rhodes method to make progress in chess. So the idea is that you look at a position, so you randomly choose a position, you think aloud, and you record yourself, and then you look at the kind of analysis that the Rhodes was doing. So you look at depth of search and so on. So I wouldn't go into that because nobody cares about how deep you analyze. But the point of recording is that you would be able to look at your own analysis. And then I would go through the analysis, for example, with the computer or with the coach, and try to find where things went wrong. And typically you make mistakes at some point. You put a queen on a square where your queen can go, and these kind of things, or you play a knight when your knight has disappeared from the board months ago. So basically, recording your protocols might a way basically to identify weaknesses like that.
Wow. Okay. I think that's some good advice. I think there's a one. I have a question. So I know you've said that the mad genius theory is wrong, but then you also mentioned the idea of transferring chess skills. Do you think that there could be some negative qualities that chess players have that are transferred, which may be why people are like, oh, if you're like really good at chess, you're mad because maybe you overthink, or maybe you're like overly I don't know, fixated on things, or maybe just like obsessive compulsive disorder or something like that?
That's a very good question. Yeah, clearly chess players, I mean, in the kind of popular culture, they are described as a bit awkward socially. I'm not sure it's always true, but that's what you find in the popular culture. Now, of course, this applies to everybody who is taken by their own domain. Mathematicians or scientists, they also appear a bit awkward because basically they prefer thinking about chess, mathematics, or science than talking about football. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, I think if you are obsessed in kind of a positive way by your domain, going back to this flow kind of phenomenon, you are going to appear a bit awkward to other people. Partly because also if you spend all your time playing chess, you are not going to follow politics and so on. And when people talk about politics, you know nothing about it. And you are going to appear a bit awkward. Now the question, whether this is due to chess or whether this is due to your own personality, which was at the beginning and then led you to an activity like chess, I think it's quite, it's open to debate. Might be a bit of both. But chess doesn't only convey negative kind of impression. So chess players are considered as very intelligent, which is true in fact, given the data I talked about before. And so, for example, in business, in particular businesses linked to the stock market, they are really like chess players because they are smart, they are obsessed by what they are doing. So the only trick is session. Rather than chess, you have to convince them to be obsessed by the stock market, and then they are very, very efficient. And I have to say that many of my PhD students, who were all absolutely brilliant, many of them were chess players. And I think they all have this quality of, partly being obsessed. And when they start doing something, they want to do it well. They don't mind spending a lot of time. Also, they have a strong discipline intellectually. Not to say that other people don't have that, but I would say that could be characteristic of chess players.
Great. I think that'd be a great place to end this because I know we've already gone a bit over time. But thank you very much, Professor Gobet. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I think everyone learned a lot. We had a lot of viewers, and it was just fun just to, chess prevails.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Gobet.
Yes, I'm going to speak on Christian's behalf because he's muted because he can't unmute because there's background noise. But I'm sure he would like to say thank you very much, Professor, and it's been interesting. And we will definitely get in contact with you again in the future if you'll give us your time again.
Sure, my pleasure, and I'll be very glad to talk to you again.
And also, you are welcome to our chess club anytime. We play online, and this is for everyone as well. We play online. You can join our Discord server. You can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. Also, please donate to Crisis UK. You can do that by following the link. Where is the link? Somewhere. It's on our page on Twitch. And yeah, all the donations will go to Crisis UK, which aims to end homelessness. Thank you all for tuning in. Hope you guys have a great day. Thank you, Professor, again.